Thank you. Right, and so one of the things I'm not saying is that Aristotle himself claims to be thinking the identity of thought and being. He basically never gets close to that, except a little bit in De Anima. And so I don't want that to be a way of, I don't want people to read Aristotle as only working out that particular identity, the identity of thought and being. There's a lot of other things going on in this text, as you've noticed, a lot of logical problems, a lot of semantic, linguistic distinctions that are important to Aristotle. And that's not all automatically thinking the identity of thought and being. And but that's one of the, and so there's that. The other thing that kind of occurred to me while I was doing this reading is that Aristotle is a great philosopher. But I mean, I mean that in this sense. What he does is very instructive for understanding what philosophy is, what it does, how it does it, what's the nature of a philosophical concept, how is it distinguished from other kinds of concepts. And so that gives us, so I've been kind of working on a series of differentiations so that we can get a better bead on the nature of a philosophical concept as over against an empirical one or an historical one or a literary one or any of these others that are often confused with philosophical concepts. And that's why we spent a probably much longer on the concept of change than seems necessary for understanding Aristotle. Right, because the idea is I wanted you to see how this, I wanted you to see this because Aristotle shows it. It's one of the only concepts in Greek thought where we can actually reconstruct, or we can grasp its genesis, how it comes about. And so I wanted to pay very, very close attention to what makes a philosophical concept incredibly unique, and then defend it a little bit against the commonplace charges that are directed against concepts that we don't understand, right? We tend to want to say, well, it's, that's just, he's generalizing grammar. He's just taking what's Greek grammar and just generalizing from it, or he's just expressing, the Athenian middle class attitudes, or some stuff like that. And that's a way to not deal with the concept. And so so I've been rubbing our noses in this concept, and especially the way in which he switches back and forth between thinking about what would have to be true of change, of the concept of change, such that it would actually be about change, and not have as a consequence the denial of change, right? And so we see that the possibility of change is one from his struggle with the Parmenidean denial of the possibility of change. And so he's not running around looking for real examples of change. What he's doing is looking at what would the possibility of, what's the minimum conditions of the possibility of change. And thinking that thought would think the possibility of change, and not have as a consequence, or not have an implicit inference, the impossibility of change. And that is what Parmenides showed a certain conception of being and a certain conception of change actually led to. So the concept of change is one at the level of its possibility, and it's not an empirical concept that would require us to find real concepts of change, or real instances of change, and then abstract certain common properties from it, and then we would have literally an abstraction. And what's interesting about Aristotle's method is that he doesn't do that. And so his concept is not an abstraction. And I think that's really hard for us to get because we always think that concepts are abstractions. And I want to point out how concept formation is not necessarily abstracting, looking for something common to a number of instances, because the original conceptual problem is which are the instances that we are supposed to take, right? And we can't just be guided by language or whatever and say, well, whatever a culture says is change, that's what change is, and we're just going to abstract a common property to all these instances of change that this culture refers to linguistically, and then we got our concept, because we don't have a concept at that point. We have an abstraction, and we don't know if that abstraction actually corresponds to anything real or not. All right. So Greg, you have your hand up, so I'm going to interrupt myself here a little bit, and just in case you wanted to address anything I've said thus far.
Actually, I wanted to ask about the difference between change and motion.
Oh, yeah.
So I would have thought they were the same, except I looked in the glossary and saw different words. And
right.
Also that I remember motion being so closely tied to efficient cause. Is any of that still going on?
So, I mean, I'm not quite sure if this really addresses what you're thinking, but Aristotle begins with a very general concept of change. And later he will show that motion is a particular instance of change. But he has to, gain the territory of change as a possible object of thought first. We must think change or alteration or othering, right? These are all different ways of talking about the same thing, right? In itself, we need to think of it in itself and as containing only those aspects that do not lead to the consequence that there is no such thing as change, because then our concept is not thinking change. We might be using the word change, but we're not thinking anything with that word. So we start with change, and then we start looking at different, if we continued the physics, we would look at very different kinds of change and then try to understand their inner structure. So motion is a kind of change. Peter, did you want to respond to Greg?
Yeah, I was just going to say a little more succinctly, maybe that
cool
change is there was a type of change for every kind of being. So being in location was one kind of change, any kind of quality, but they all required that there be some underlying subject, he said. And again, we still haven't quite got to the bottom of what the relationship between subject and substance really is.
Right.
But anyway, so that you can change with respect to any of the types of being if there's something that remains the same, I guess.
Right. No, that's a very good point. And it makes me wonder if we maybe should have read the entirety of the categories, but that would have been such a long prelude, right? Because it's in the categories that Aristotle defends, that there are that being is said in many ways, and there are fundamentally 10 different ways in which being is said, and so anything that we treat as being must be first reflected upon. Is it a quality? Is it a quantity? Is it a passion? Is it a substance, right? And then only once we've located the being in one of the categories, right, then we can continue the inquiry into its further its intrinsic properties, its accidental properties, and make those distinctions. Clark.
Yeah, I'm listening to you, and I am one that you are speaking to. I
know, yeah.
And as are the rest of us. I'm struggling, and I'm listening, and I'm giving, you're saying that a concept stands for thinking change. So it's not a concept. It's actually a meter of some sort that is measuring something in the external world that we call thinking change. And that concept doesn't fall prey to being called an abstraction.
Right.
Because this meter whatever this homunculus or whatever is so accurate that it can short circuit the problems of conceptualizing something, predicating it, that we can suggest that it's not an abstraction. And I don't see how you can get there.
Okay,
You've
cool.
got to go through it. But let me more pointedly say it. And I do appreciate if you did read my essay. I read it a half hour ago and I go, that's terrible. So
no.
The point, but I want to try to make the point a little clearer. There's a status of being, if you want to call it that, to something before it changes. Let's just call it something changes from A to B.
Yeah.
Something changes from A to D. We have language describing that. A has a certain property of being. B has a certain property of being. And I see Parmenides as saying that there's no way around this. It's only being. If you want to say that changes, then that's a non-sequitur. That cannot be. That cannot be that something that you're saying is being is also changing.
Right. Exactly.
Because it's that's the antithesis of being, right? So what it seems to me is that Aristotle is positing a third term in the middle there, in a sense.
Yeah.
From A to B, if he's claiming that Parmenides is wrong, if he's refuting Parmenides, then there has to be something in the middle that does not change, but yet still has being. And that would be the underlying substance. That is not at all convincing to me. It sounds like a concoction.
Yeah.
And I still don't see how he's even refuted Parmenides. So I like, if I think he has refuted Parmenides, then I can participate in the discussion and change. And I think it's very illuminating. But I can't get past that, and I'm wondering where I'm messing up here.
No, you're not messing up. It's all completely legitimate. And that's why I want to have these informal sessions, because I want these bigger questions to be aired and then see how far we can get. But I see two responses. So first Peter and then Ed.
So Clark used a trigger word for me, so I'm going to have to just respond to that. He was talking about the accuracy of a comment or of a concept or something like that, which I don't think like a concept has levels of accuracy, as it were. The concept just is what it is. When we come from an empirical point of view and we're doing science, we can get closer and closer to something, or the data may or may come closer and closer, but that's a very different thing than a concept, which in some sense always is what it is. And it's never not what it is. I mean, there seems to be something amiss with that sort of sense that you could sort of sneak up on it. And somebody also says, I think it was that, Tyler said in the chat, you can't measure concepts, which is sort of getting at the same idea. If you can measure it, you can be more or less accurate. This is a concept plus or minus 2 thoughts or whatever. I don't know how you measure concepts, but that was just a reaction I had.
Awesome, thanks. Right. Clark, if there's anything that you immediately occurs to you and as a response to somebody who's responding to you, just go ahead and just gesture, and then I'll let you do that before I call on the next person. So, but I don't see a gesture, so maybe we'll let Ed go.
I just don't want to monopolize this. I get so much more out of it if I listen. So
no, can I just say that it's intelligent opposition and intelligent resistance that makes thoughts clearer. And so there's absolutely no reason for you to worry about monopolizing. You don't talk nearly as much as me. So okay, so a couple of hands. Ed, you were there and then you disappeared. Ed, you want to
so I guess I would say I don't think I see Parmenides as claiming that you've got A and you've got B and you just can't move between the two, and both A and B are, because I understand Parmenides to be denying not only change but also plurality, so that you can't have anything other than A.
Right.
So there'd be no problem of getting from A to B because there can't be a B. There can only be an A.
Right. No, I'm with you there, but I think if, I mean, Parmenides takes his logic and goes to me, an absurd life denying, narrative. So that would be to the extreme case. Just to get before there though, if you were to, I don't know that what I described, or are you saying that what I described as there being an A and B is not consistent with what he's claiming though? It's another way of saying the same thing, basically.
Yeah, I mean, at least that's my understanding, is that he's denying motion, he's denying change, he's denying the past, he's denying the future, and he's denying plurality. And so, and then what you're saying, which I think is a perfectly fair response, is, well, hey, that just throws all of life out the window. So, that seems a little weird. And I think, I've always wondered, well, what if I went in a time machine back to talk to Parmenides and said, hey, Parmenides, you seem to be saying that plurality, change, and motion are all illusions. But then that would mean you would have no one to convince out of the illusion, because there would be no one to have the illusion. Who are you talking to that could possibly be subject to this illusion, since none of them exist? And I imagine, I don't know if anybody would agree, but I imagine his answer would be, well, I'm sorry, don't look at me. That's just logic. If you go to the law, if you just trust logic, this is the conclusion you have to come to. And if it seems like we exist and it seems like there's all this other stuff going on, that's just too bad. I can't do anything about that. It doesn't seem to make sense from this one side, but that one side isn't logic, and I'm just going with logic. So that's all I can do.
Yeah, well, but Aristotle doesn't do that. He doesn't just say, hey, look, there's no life
Right.
there. He's saying, no, I actually want to make a point. I want to take Parmenides seriously. And I'm going to demonstrate to you that there is change. And not eliminate being and go with, what's his name, Heraclitus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, great.
Yeah.
Right. Let's see, I see Garth, and then I see Philip. I'm just going to add the one thing, denying the reality of appearances, or the way things appear, is pretty common in philosophy, and you certainly find Kant doing it, right? Anything that appears is the appearance of something else that you can never know, right? And so anything empirical, it's all useful, but it's not an object of, it's not the object of proper knowledge. So, between Parmenides, so you'll find this gesture, you'll find this kind of argument in many philosophers, and it's varied in many different ways. And right, so I'm just making that it's not just a Parmenidean thing, or maybe the spirit of Parmenides just keeps getting reborn over and over again in each generation of philosophers, where some great thinker kind of recognizes that, the reality is elsewhere and not in anything that's ever given to the senses. Anyway,
Parmenides is,
oh yeah. Pardon me?
Parmenides is the one guy who can't be reborn, right?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, exactly. That's right, because he never ceased to be.
I want to say that I don't think Aristotle ever uses the term concept. Like, if we start talking about concepts, we've already moved past the Greek way of thinking. The Greeks, I don't think, used the term concept.
No, you're right. You're right. And I introduced that under advisement, actually, that we speak this way. And if we are to understand Aristotle, we are to understand two things: why he doesn't speak that way, and what might have gone wrong that led us to start speaking this way. And so opening up those two cans of worms is kind of the point of being very careful about how to using the term concept. but obviously it's going to invite all the associations that we have with the term, and so those have to be worked through. And I'm totally open to that. That's just part of the learning process of this course. Okay, I got several hands.
Yeah, can I just say something?
Oh yeah, please,
more?
please, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think a a lot of the objections that I've heard so far to this Aristotelian way of thinking about change come from trying to have sort of like an object that you use your concepts to understand, which is not at all the way Aristotle seems to think about these things.
Right, right. And there's certainly one thing that there is no such thing in Greek outside of the imagination as mental representation. That's totally imported from very specific Cartesian assumptions. And so when I use concept, I never want anybody to think mental representation. That belongs to imagination for the Greeks. That's fantasia. That is not knowing anything. So as a matter of fact, you know, a representation in imagination, like the representation of a statue, is just an instance of the form of that statue, and it's no different than the instance of the statue that's in the forum and in the books, right? These are all, any mental representation is just an instance of a concept or an instance of the idea or the instance of a form. And so kind of getting, so recognizing that means that we have to get past the whole idea of mental representation in order to understand things like form and what it is to know form. All right, so thanks to the, so yeah, got several hands now. Philip, Tyler, then Ed again.
Hi, yeah. So my question has been partially touched on, so I'm going to have to modify it. I was going to ask what Greek word he's using for concept, but it sounds like it's not. It sounds like you're importing that idea deliberately, that word deliberately, right, to shape the conversation.
Exactly.
What would be the closest equivalent for Aristotle to concept, the word he actually uses?
Well, in the Anima, he says, you know, that form and what does he say there? Form and the noema, that which the nous thinks, are one, right? So we have that identity. So basically form, right? The forms of things are their reality, and they're intrinsically intelligible. And so the only thing that can grasp the intelligible is that which is capable of grasping the intelligible. Our word for that is concept. His word for that is intellect. And the intellect is complex structure. So we have to get into that. But there is no one-to-one equivalent. So we always have to be careful in this terrain. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that is. That's very helpful. So I guess what I'm wondering is, like sometimes when a philosopher introduces let's say a notion, that notion is meant to be pondered over. It's meant to do a lot of philosophical work. You're supposed to sort of agonize over understanding that notion. And sometimes you're just supposed to accept the notion, move on, and the agonizing philosophical work comes later when you apply the notion. So I get it that we're not talking about abstractions. We're talking about something else. And so it's a two-part question. Could you say a bit more about what the something else is? Not abstraction, but something else. And is it something we're just supposed to accept as a stipulation and then move on and do the philosophical work? Or are we supposed to agonize over understanding the actual word and its meaning?
I just, I wanted us to look at what we would call a concept, and Aristotle would call the thing, namely change, and how he arrives at it, and what it means to arrive at it the way he does. And so I don't want to pour too many dogmatic claims over it. I just kind of want to open it up for contemplation. You know, what is going, what is this change that he's talking about. He's not, he's arriving at it through a dialectical examination of the presuppositions of a Parmenidean conception of being, right? That's not how people usually think you get to the concept of change, right? People tend to think that we know what change is, and so all we need to do is abstract something familiar. and Aristotle says, not so fast. You don't know what change is, because the way you usually talk about change entails the impossibility of change. So you thought you knew what you were talking about, but you didn't. So what we're going to do is to find out whether there really is something to, whether it is really possible to talk about change, or whether we have to just acknowledge that Parmenides has shown that change is impossible. Right. So that's my short and probably not very satisfactory answer to your interesting question, Philip. But I'm going to get a couple more hands, and if you want to come back to it, please do. Tyler.
And then I was going to just introduce a quick thing on observation and measurement. And I want to point out just real quickly that these are activities we do, but they're not observable activities. They're not objects. And so part of understanding the distinction between philosophy and science, as well as what an adequate method for either would be, is understanding this distinction between activities and empirical objects, right? Because you cannot observe the activity of observation as an empirical object. And just like with measurement, right? So science cannot adequately account for that which is presupposed by its method, which are these particular relations between activities. And so I think Aristotle is going to be important for helping us understand activity as such.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Turning things around. Ed?
You're muted. You're muted.
Yeah, just sort of some of the things that are kind of getting thrown up here are this question of concept, and what it's making me think on the one hand is that, like, what Greeks, or at least Aristotle, is doing when we say concept, we're pointing to some place that's kind of between three different things for Aristotle, and he never goes to that particular place, and that would be form, knowledge, and and you mentioned intellect. Form, knowledge, and intellect are all kind of in that same area. Now we're pointing at the concept, and the concept is what we're pointing at with concept is kind of floating between those three things.
Right.
And so when Aristotle says form or intellect or knowledge, he's in the ballpark of what we're using the word concept to point at.
Right. Right.
And
yeah.
And it's also making me think of this. It's also making me think of the word, that you'd brought this up, mental representation. And this comes up like when you're reading Kant, and there's this word, this German word Vorstellung, which is translated, in different ways. But the real irony of this word, of course, is that the word Vorstellung is the German translation of the English word idea. And then the problem with that is that this English word idea is coming from the empiricists. Right. And so the English word idea means precisely that which you can only get through sensation. Whereas the Greek word idea is the exact opposite, because it's the intelligible, which is something which can never be grasped through the senses. And so Kant uses the German word Idee to point to that Greek idea, and he's using Vorstellung to point to the English word idea, which means, an empirical concept, as they say. Right. And so, but that also gives a clue as to the difference between what's going on when we're saying stuff in English and the stuff that's going on in the Greek, because that English word idea is the opposite of what the Greeks meant by idea.
Exactly. That's fabulous. And it did make me think about something else that as an answer to Philip's question. Aristotle starts us off by thinking about names. And so name belongs into this whole cluster of things that we capture with concept. But even more important than name, right? The name doesn't function in thought unless an account is given of the name. And the account, right, is the so-called definition, and the definition more or less corresponds to what we mean by the content of a concept, right? So the definition, the logos is, right, the logos is close to what we think of as the concept, but only if we give up thinking of the concept as a mental representation. Because when we know something, when we know a state of affairs, we don't know our mental representation. We know the state of affairs. And we get into subjective idealism and all the problems that come from that, which is not a Greek problem. So I don't want to go into it too much, but we just become subjective idealist if all we know are the images in our head, so to speak, and that all knowledge would be about that. So just to take that up with Philip, I think perhaps the best term besides form that corresponds to what we are after when we talk about the concept of something, its concept, is logos, which is the definition of a name, like change. The Greeks define change in such a way that that entails Parmenides' critique. And so if there is to be the name change is to be thought in a way, or is to be defined in a way, to not entail its own impossibility, right? Then the definition has to be changed in such a way that it captures most of the phenomena that the original term was intended to refer to, but it doesn't have the inner contradiction. And so then we have a name with an account that's not internally contradictory, and the name with that's, I think, perhaps the best way to think about the concept. All right, awesome, thank you. That was very helpful, Ed. I really appreciate that. Clark.
So this is what nominalism doesn't get, what you just described, that there can be a way of naming something where it does not participate in a contradiction.
Right.
So there seems to be what the way Ed, you were saying, I like the way you posed these two, like an idea comes from a more modern empirical world viewpoint, and that was not shared and did not have an analog to what preceded it. So there's a clear change. There's two different alien races here, and one, Parmenian, one changed in being to the other. I don't know how that happened. So we're trying to figure out how it happened.
Yes.
And that's what I'm interested in, because Aristotle is interesting to me largely because he's so relevant to the modern era, because he says, no, I'm not going to come to you merely or solely, exclusively from that non-idea realm of being attached to empiricism, as you're talking about it, Ed.
Right.
Right. So Aristotle's saying something different, and he said it way back then. Right. I'm trying to figure out, though, if it is something.
Yeah.
I know he's talking about it as if it's something, but I don't yet have a grasp of it. Because really, I am interested in learning Aristotle in terms of Aristotle. But that's only one of two things I'm trying to do. I want to learn Aristotle in terms of Aristotle, how it relates to me today.
Yeah.
And the issues that we're going through. So it's not just simply about walking in Aristotle's shoes.
Right.
I would get nowhere there. I would not walk in his shoes. I'd walk in somebody else's shoes, try to walk in my own shoes, for instance. Yeah. But anyway, yeah.
Right. A lot of contemporary philosophical conceptions are just literally abstractions from whatever the most recent philosophy of science is. And And so that's the kind of trap that we find ourselves in as moderns, right? We look to scientists, and then we abstract some things, and then from that, and then so therefore concepts are abstractions, and what's really going on is in science. But then we find out it's all just hypotheses and disconfirmations, and it's asymptotic approaches, and it gets all really, really messy. So our philosophy is incredibly incoherent and messy, and so we both need to be able to see it from an outside vantage point, but we need the vantage point to be internally consistent, so we would know what it would be like to think that way. And I'm not saying that Aristotle is the end goal here, but it is practice in a kind of thought that puts internal consistency, makes it premium, and not just something you can abstract from or something like that. That internal consistency is the thing that we're looking for in thought. Anyway, Peter, and then Philip.
So Clark's little example of, like, there's two alien beings, two different tribes or whatever it was you said, alien races or something, that were approaching philosophy, I guess, or how to think about things. One being this empirical representational thing, and of course the other one, of course, that always just brings back that. I guess it hit me like a ton of bricks, this whole Schmidt argument. It was like in the preface to the preface of one of his book, but a philosophy of distinction versus a philosophy of representation. Mm-hmm. And if you think of distinctions as merely being something that, what is intelligibility? Is being able to distinguish one thing from another. And that doesn't deal with representation. That's just drawing the distinction and being able to kind of split the world into two or more groups, split thought into, or possibilities into two different things. I don't want to say the world because it's not an empirical thing, which is exactly the point. That intelligibility based on distinction has absolutely nothing to do with representations. And yet almost all of modern philosophy is all about, oh no, is my representation going to correspond to the world? And all those problems we have with that. Mm-hmm. Even Hegel gets back to it again, where he talks about the difference between mere correctness, mm-hmm. which is the formal relationship of an idea to its object, mm-hmm. versus truth, which is the relation of an object, the concept to itself, and it's right. And it gets much closer back to that old Greek way of saying things. Anyway, it's just, mm-hmm. Anyway.
That's right. So what we're doing here is, eventually we're going to be able to compare in our own reflective processes, the kind of thinking that starts with perceptions and abstracts from them, and then gets into all the skeptical problems, and then it ends up in the matrix, or ends up or just defeatist. Then it's like, they're my definitions, it's my truth, and nobody can take away from me, and that whole thing, right? Or think about the internal consistency of the definition and see what that definition captures in that. And so there we have, so to speak, the modern and the ancient methods, and we have to work them out in our heads ourselves to see what we can take from each one, or whether we're going to reject one or reject the other, or whatever. That's, so to speak, something that can only go on in your own thought, and then in our conversations. But I think, but the whole point of studying Aristotle is to give people a really give them an opportunity to wrap their arms around what thought looks like to learn the kind of thinking that takes internal consistency of the definitions seriously. And it doesn't just say, well, there's some contradictions here, but pragmatically, it's working great, and so we're just going to run with it, because ultimately we don't care about theoretical knowledge. All we care about is practical effects. Right? That's what happens with all of our sloppy concepts. In modernity, we're like, well, practical value. Yeah. Okay. 2 hands. First Philip, and then Sandy.
Okay. So I wanted to talk a bit about Parmenides. It seems like in Parmenides there's a tension between the structure of his argument and the conclusion of his argument. The conclusion of the argument is obviously that change is not possible, but the structure of the argument involves change. You move from premises to conclusions. There's motion within that argument. So clearly for Parmenides, the movement of, let's call it, thought or argument is part of the world of illusion. And I won't be anachronistic, so I won't say whether this argument is being instantiated in a mind or in somehow in reason itself or in the structure of reality or whatever. But whatever it is, however it's being instantiated, for Parmenides, it's in the realm of illusion. Whereas for Aristotle, it doesn't seem like arguments are in the realm of illusion at all. They seem very important, very real. And I'm wondering if this could be a way to get some common ground between Parmenides and Aristotle, like to say that it's a half-baked thought, but something like Aristotle takes the reasoning part to be part of reality, and therefore he's able to sort of go further with the argument. It's a half-baked thought. Let's see what anybody can do with it.
Does anybody have any responses to that? I think there's a very important, there's a very important point for me anyway. Any theory that makes nonsense of the thinking of that theory has a problem, right? It is blind to itself and therefore blind to any thought. And so that is a serious, at least philosophical defect, even if it has some kind of practical value or whatever. So I think that's, although we could discuss, how within his poem Parmenides deals with that problem, and I think that there is a way to think about it. Certainly, I think Aristotle totally agrees with you that thought is an activity, and activity is, at least in some of its manifestations, motion, and so therefore thought also belongs to nature. So I don't. I see a bunch of hands. I'm not quite sure if it's a response to what Philip said or new questions. So I'm just going to ask if anybody wants to respond directly to Philip. Go ahead and do that now, and then we'll go to the hands.
Is something I haven't heard that I always associate as Parmenides' slogan is something along the lines of being is and not being is not.
Yeah.
And then there's this problem. I don't know if it occurs in Parmenides himself, but a big deal, at least for one Plato dialogue, that you can't speak of what is not.
Right.
And so I don't know if Parmenides said that, but if you attach that to Parmenides, then if Parmenides can say anything in an argument, what he has said is, because he wouldn't have been able to find words for it if he was talking about what is not. And so in a sense, everything Parmenides says is true and exists, and there is no change. So
I'm just going to throw this out there, just as a way to think about this, right? A thought that is intrinsically one will be expressed in many words. And it's not the manyness of the words that is the unity of the thought, but it's the unity of the thought that allows these words to interact with one another in such a way that they express one thing. So if we think about Parmenides as saying, yeah, I have to speak, but my speech, which is many and takes time, isn't the point. The point is the one being that appears in that, and that is the unity, and it makes it possible and makes these words combine and these sentences combine into one thought. So he has to take the detour through the plurality, but he's also appealing to the fact that we all know, or we all have had the experience that, the many different letters and the many different words can and often do express some one thing. And that unity that shines through is being. And it's not about the words, but it's what they allow, their combination and the way that they combine and the way the letters combine, what is allowed to manifest in that. So that would be one way of looking at how maybe Parmenides could deal with this problem. Just I'm gonna defend him a little bit anyway. Yeah. So hopefully that makes sense. A little bit of thinking about the one and the many and the various words that in various languages that take time, and they have all sorts of different shapes and morphemes and phonemes and all the rest of it. But yet they all, can express the one thought: snow is white, to use a favorite analytic example. Anyway, yeah, thanks. I hope that detour was interesting or helpful.
Yeah, can I just speak to Philip? Is that
Oh
his
yeah,
name?
please. Yeah.
Area code 613. Yeah. Yeah, I like what you're saying, Philip. And I think, but it's a more of a modern view, isn't it? Because what I'm struggling with is how to understand Aristotle's response to Parmenides. That's all I'd say. I like it because that's where I'm coming from, what you kind of suggested, looking at structurally, and that kind of thing. But clearly Aristotle doesn't take that low-hanging fruit and bite into it.
Mm.
He actually takes Parmenides seriously at another level that I'm trying to figure out, but clearly is not what I'm naturally wanting to do.
Yeah.
Can I respond to that?
Oh yeah, please do.
Yeah, okay. First of all, only my mom calls me area code 613. But it seems like the fact that Parmenides' argument had a temporal structure, had a structure that was unfolding in time, didn't seem to make much of an impression on Parmenides. It didn't make him one day sit up straight and go, oh, wait, there has to be time because this argument is unfolding in time. That never happened for Parmenides. But for Aristotle, it seems like whatever's going on in the realm of thought or logos or intellect, that stuff seems real to Aristotle. It seems to make an impression on him. He seems to think that that's part of being. And it just seemed like this could be a way of getting a genuine dialogue between Aristotle and Parmenides, where they were talking on kind of the same terms, like where Aristotle's clearly saying, hey, this logos stuff, this intellect stuff, it's real, and Parmenides is clearly saying, no, it's not, and then they could hash it out at that level.
Awesome. I appreciate the suggestion. Maybe there's a way to develop it through the text when we get back to it. So I appreciate that. Sandy and then Garth, thanks for your patience.
I was also responding.
Sorry. I apologize, Garth. I think Sandy was first.
Yeah, but is Sandy responding to the question that was asked, or?
Oh, are you responding to Philip too? Okay, my bad.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just had to wait
Where's
for
Sandy?
two other people. Which I just wanted to say that I often think about something from the outlines of Pyrrhonism when I think about this issue here, or the idea of illusion, so to speak, which, is, for example, is honey sweet, or is honey not actually sweet and it is only sweet because we taste it? It's like the argument, like, does the tree that falls in the forest make a sound or not? And the reason that arises for us is sort of our suspicion, which we can blame on Descartes, I guess, our suspicion that everything we experience isn't real in some sense. And it seems like, it seems to me that Parmenides is not really making an argument like that. Parmenides is arguing within the sphere of being, or what being is. Right. And because he makes different distinctions in being, he comes to a very naturalistic conclusion, which is that every time something quote unquote changes, it really has no relation to what it was before. There's no connection between those things. And so there is no change itself. There is just what is. And even like the notion of time breaks down, because in order to have any awareness of time, you must have an awareness of motion. And you will see this argument in Aristotle as well, when he talks about time later in the physics. Okay, yeah, that's it.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. Sandy.
It just seems like when I came in that you guys made immense progress in my absence. And I was just really kind of amazed. Like, what did I miss? Just wondering. And then you went even further when Philip started talking with his question. I was like, what's going on? But are we gonna, just from what Garth just said, are we gonna read the part where Aristotle talks about time and the physics in your group, Michael, here? Just out of
I hadn't
curiosity.
planned on it. I hadn't planned on it, but if there's a clamoring of the masses that we hit the continuum and time, yeah, I'm open to that. We'll just have to read Aristotle longer than originally planned.
Oh, okay.
to get to De Anima. But if these questions are things that move you and that you want to understand better, then we should take advantage of it.
I mean, is time going to be something?
No.
Because no. You don't even hear me. You can finish my question.
I'm purposely sidestepping a lot of time questions.
No, I'm just talking about generally more in terms of this cathedral he's trying to build. Okay. Yeah. My experiences with a lot of thinkers, and I'm not at this point assuming Aristotle is going to be this way. But is that eventually when you start catching up with them and their ideas and you slowly start, the unity starts coming together in your mind, there will be other concepts or pieces that fall into place that just kind of seem very logical. And right. You might even start anticipating it. You know what I mean? When you get that far in, because it all hangs together so perfectly, it makes sense. And I was wondering if time is going to be something like that for Aristotle, because the way Garth kind of described it, right. It kind of seemed like maybe it would be, in which case maybe it's not as scary as maybe it might appear.
Yeah, I mean, if people have a good sense of motion and change, then you're pretty well equipped to deal with his understanding of time.
Okay.
But it's not central to the central books of the metaphysics, and it's not central to most of De Anima. Little parts about perception, time plays a role, but it just didn't seem central to me, so I didn't focus on it. But it'll be very Plotinus takes it very, very seriously. So maybe Plotinus is the time to dive into the question of time and the relationship of time as motion and eternity, and then look back at a couple of texts from the physics concerning Aristotle's views on times and see how they're duplicated and developed and gone beyond in Plotinus. So that might be the right occasion for that. I don't.
Okay, I mean, that sounds cool.
But you guys can all meet behind my back and then take over the group and say, we're doing time, whether you like it or not.
Well, I am gonna start Proust soon, so it kind of segues into that. And I saw that Nick, who's not here today, is also in the Proust group that I'm going to be joining, interestingly enough. So
who is that?
Nick, the Asian guy.
Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great.
But I did just want to, I mean, you guys are already so far advanced from like when my comment was supposed to come in at this point.
I'm sorry.
But when you were talking earlier about nominalism and I guess the Schmidt argument, and which is related back to the limits, I guess, of modernity or the mistakes. Right. And Michael, you said something about everything being practical.
Right.
I actually think it's so much worse than that. I would disagree with you. I would say I feel nostalgic for pragmatism at this point. I would like to, if we could just be there, I think we'd be better than where we are now. My experience of the now And the problems we're facing is closer to when Schmidt talks about the metaphysical overload.
Mm.
And I mean, maybe, maybe the pragmatism thing just inevitably leads to that because it
Right.
doesn't answer the metaphysical questions. And
Mhm.
as a result, they don't really go away.
Right.
And then it builds up, kind of like there's a neglect, it builds up over time. And then at some point it just becomes like that thing you then can't ignore, but then nobody has access to really even approaching it properly because everything has been through this practical, empirical realm. That's been sort of the approach, and that's the only thing anybody knows. And so they just, and we just see extremely pathetic attempts to answer metaphysical questions in that way, right? Which just are laughable, which is why all the skeptics and atheists are not totally wrong when they reject it, of course, because the answers that those people are giving are just completely off the mark, right? But then the sad thing is we never get anywhere closer to actually answering the questions, right? Does that make sense? Everything I just said, right? Like,
It does help account for the this pervasive skepticism and know nothingism that our culture's struggling with, definitely.
Yeah, and then certain things which for classical philosophers were not that mysterious and weird, like metaphysical things, in our culture becoming incredibly just impossible to reckon with. Like we can't even get beyond like the baby step because it's just so overwhelming, or something like emotions, right? Or because I was literally at the doctor yesterday and they gave me this depression questionnaire and they said, have you been feeling, down or unmotivated without reason? And I just got in their face and I said, there's always a reason. I said, there's no such thing as feeling that way without a reason. I said, what are you talking about? I've been depressed. Like I've had reasons to feel that way. I've been angry. I've been irritable. Like maybe it doesn't always correspond properly, but like the idea that they just say, oh, and then they just leave it at that. Oh, it just happens without reason, and then here's a medication. That's the practical fix, right? For how to deal. So it's just, sometimes it's a little alarming when you go into the world and you see how messed up everything is.
That's true.
And I guess that Aristotle is giving us hope, even though I was really frustrated with it last time. I know I know he's leading us in the right direction. I'm just struggling with his very, very dry method of getting us there.
That is a downside. But whether he leads us anywhere that we need to go, or whether it's somebody that took his thought and well, but we need to be able to recognize that, and that's part of the point. I'm just gonna let Ed get in here, and then sorry. No, absolutely. Thank you, Sandy. No, I think the topical relevance of this stuff is always interesting to bring up.
There you go. I guess a question came into my mind. I was just curious because you were talking about kind of what you saw as the Greek conception of philosophy and what a philosophical concept would be, and it made me wonder if you, with your idea of what you're seeing as philosophy, if you were thereby in your own mind cutting off non-Western philosophy, and then the idea occurred to me that that if your answer to that question was yes, I thought that you might say, to be fair, you're also cutting off modern philosophy with the same knife.
Um, yeah, I don't know very much. I don't know very much about other religious cultures. So I don't know what I don't know what I'm cutting off, to be honest. I need that's why I need groups to help me explore that question. I'm only going to say one thing. You know, there is a school called the traditional philosophy or something like that, and you know, they're usually people who do unity of religion stuff and are a little bit on the esoteric side, and so they're thinking the unity of the religions and the source and ground of the fundamental structures that that are constitutive of world religions. And I just have to say they sound a whole lot like Aristotle and Plotinus. So so I don't feel like, as a matter of fact, I feel like following this is getting closer to the source of distinction itself, and all religions are themselves working out these distinctions. And so understanding where the common root lies is not to get to look empirically at a bunch of religions and then abstract some common feature, but to actually not think that way, which is just to create a mental representation, but understand the inner logic of the fundamental distinctions out of which all of these ways of perceiving totality or ways of thinking totality have their inner logic. And so so yeah, personally, I don't know very much about the empirical lay of the land of most cultural religions and the rest of it, but this particular school has given me some hope that there is a way to see something fundamentally common and not just abstractly common to what the Greeks are doing and what the Hindus were doing, and you know, a couple of those primordial axial religions, as Jasper calls them, right? The axial age, and all this amazing stuff all of a sudden, where all of a sudden human beings are thinking about the whole and not just, you know, what tool.
Right.
What
I
tool
mean, what it sounds like you're saying is that you don't have a lot of detail about non-Western philosophy,
Right.
but your gut feeling is that you have a reason to have faith or hope that
Right.
that they're drinking from the same trough, basically.
Yeah, no, exactly right. Exactly right. Philip. Philip is muted. Oh, there you go.
There we go. I just thought I'd mention the way you describe traditionalism makes it sound very nice, but I should mention that it has pretty fascist overtones. Like a lot of the people who identify as traditionalists, I would describe them as more making up fantasies about traditional religions rather than discovering true things about traditional religions. Like Steve Bannon, Alexander Dugin, who's one of Putin's advisors.
Maybe
It has a
use the wrong.
Yeah, just saying it has a dark side, and I wouldn't really describe it as a serious attempt to unify religions, because, like I said, it's more making up things. I once heard it described as Dungeons and Dragons for racists, which
there's definitely that out there. There's definitely that out there. I totally agree with you, but those aren't the people I'm actually thinking of, and so. But you're totally right. I mean, you know, everything that is foreign to the mainstream of Western thought, and including the mainstream of Western thought, has this dark side. And we just have to look and see, do these consequences that people draw from these doctrines, are they just do they actually follow from them, or are they imposing, you know, these consequences, whatever fascism, whatever, on these doctrines because they need some kind of propaganda justification for their bullshit? You know, that's all totally legit, but it's not my project. You're totally right that the traditionalists have this thing going on, but the unity of religions crowd actually has some interesting thought, and that's the only part that I'm saying.
Yeah. And I get it how I like, you know, I spent an awful lot of time reading Heidegger and really wondering what the hell I'm doing. I mean, he was a card-carrying Nazi, right? So yeah, I get it how, sometimes a thinker can be, have value in one level and be kind of horrifying at another level. So.
Right. I mean, yeah, I think that Heidegger's being in time is a complete resuscitation of Aristotle, right? And I don't think that means that Aristotle has fascist implications or anything like that. If Heidegger hadn't lived in Germany but somewhere else, maybe he would never have had the fascist temptation. I don't know, but I just wanted to say, Heidegger's particularly fascinating when you have some Aristotelian background and see how Dasein and all the rest of these things are as just a retooling of the Energia Dunamis stuff in Aristotle. So anyway, yeah, but thank you. No, it's important that when I make just casual reference to a group like that does have a sordid side, I appreciate mentioning that, this is a double-edged sword. So
yeah, incidentally, Alexander Dugin is a really good, I hate to admit it, but he's a really good reader of Heidegger. He doesn't shy away from the Nazism, and Dugin's Heidegger is very coherent in a way that, a lot of Western readings of Heidegger aren't, because they're deliberately trying to avoid the fascist overtones.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, I have to say that I'm just going to say that the foundations of Heidegger's thought that then developed into being in time and stuff far predated any kind of conservative revolution or National Socialism and stuff like that. So it was. So I think it is correct to disassociate the two, despite his decisions. But that's a super interesting conversation that we'll have to do an informal to talk about Heidegger, a meta informal. Anyway, yeah. So we got Garth and then Sandy.
Well, I think if we're going to talk about undertones, we have to also maybe mention that what are the undertones of Christianity? I mean, Christianity is like a cult that took Stoic philosophy and put it at its like metaphysical core to fix all of their own problems with their thinking. And so like everything that isn't true has some flaw to it. And if you take that flaw and ignore it and make it your ideology, you're going to have some disaster that occurs in the end. Whether that's fascism or complete destruction of the environment or Stalinism or just 1,000 other kinds of things. That's just what happens, I think, when you're overly dogmatic. And I think that's why people practice philosophy. So I think if you trust yourself, then you shouldn't have to worry about whether what you're reading is going to, secretly influence your mind. Or, the other thing that really bothers me is if you don't really address somebody's ideas and you just try to psychoanalyze them or something like that, then you're not doing philosophy anymore. And where is the justification? Where is the proof that anything in psychoanalysis is true? Or anything in fascism or anti-fascism, for that matter, is true? It's already divorced itself from like the path of the truth. So it just really bothers me when people cast shade on thinkers just because of their associations or something like that, because it's like nostalgia for the present. Like, it's like saying, oh, well, whatever we think today has no flaws, even though like we are part of a country that has like bombed and destroyed Iraq and Afghanistan basically for no reason, among other things.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Garth. We've strayed a little bit from Aristotle. And yeah, so let's try to stay on the things that are compelling and the things that are mysterious to you about Aristotle in terms of what we've read thus far, and talk about this. I don't want to talk about Christianity personally without actually reading a Christian text, and you got to be very focused on details, and people can have different takes on Christianity and what philosophical sources are, stuff like that. So I'd rather not get into that whole discussion because we wouldn't actually be dealing with texts that would control our interpretations. Right, and that was my fault for bringing up the traditionalists just naively. So I totally own this. I apologize. Anyway, Sandy, what's up?
Oh, I had no idea what you were talking about when you were talking about traditionalists. I just kind of got this vague image in my head of these ecumenical, let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya crowd. And then somebody says they're Nazis. And I'm like, actually, maybe they are not. Maybe the Kumbaya people are Nazis. Maybe that is a good insight. but I don't really like. I understand your general statement about that, and I guess it's not really relevant to bring up names. It's just kind of like, hey, if people are contemplating the truth, like whether they're in Asia or Asia Minor, Greece, whatever, like they should be hitting on something that's universal. Right. And I guess, somebody who gets really upset about that or thinks that that's not possible, the nationalists, as I like to call them, who like to emphasize the ethnic brain differences and why we can see things, or the light in Greece, right? Exactly. That ridiculous argument. Yeah. Or the macrobiotic diet of the East, allowing them to have insights that we wouldn't have. Or, I don't know, it's like, it's silly. It's silly to me. But somebody said during all of that something about, they were talking about religion, which I'm like, well, I'm the religion heavyweight in this group. You guys should really join Gerard if you want to know what religion is. But like there was this, religion came up, and then stuff that sounded like ideology. I don't know if somebody said anything about actually use the word ideology, or somebody mentioned Stalin. But there was this idea that kind of surfaced where there's like, oh, people do religion or dogma, and then there's philosophy. And then like philosophy is kind of like the option for the smart people or the ones who want to rise above. I'm not saying I disagree with that, but doesn't it seem a bit misleading to assume that it's an either or with philosophy? It seems to me that Aristotle, or at least my experience so far of Aristotle, is not that he's leading us into this better way of doing things that gets us further, even though certainly that's an element of it. But when you do philosophy, you actually realize there is no way not to do philosophy. Like we're always reasoning either poorly or better in a way that makes more sense, right? We're either falling into illogic or logic. We're either going into the truth or we're getting further away from it and deceiving ourselves. So that's what philosophy is all about, is to try and get us to see the truth of things, not because it's a cool option to have as opposed to being religious, but because we're doing it anyway. And we don't really have a choice as human beings except to do that. It's what we do kind of as Homo sapiens, right? That's my, I guess. So I would just be weary of anybody seeing philosophy as being some kind of option, as opposed to something that is actually much closer to just human condition, and its relationship to that. And it seems to me that Aristotle is in that mindset as well, because one thing that's really crazy about Aristotle is we'll spend all this time, right? Like I'll say, like, talking about this thing and thinking about it, and we'll spend sessions on it. And then remember how I'd always say, like, we spend so much time on this, and then it just turns out to be something totally banal, right? And then I'm just like, it's so frustrating, because I'm like, I was expecting there to be some big payoff or something awesome. But I think it's important that he does that, because why does he do that? Because he's showing us that we're doing all this already anyway. Like it's so part of how we function as people, and our minds, and our reason. And so it reminds me of like that, I don't know, like those really I don't know how to articulate this, but maybe you know what I mean. Like when somebody seems to be able to read your mind or predict your behavior, you know, just because they have a certain intuition or they're a little bit, and it's like, you're really amazed by that because you're like, wow, that's true. Like I totally do that, or I did that. And it's like, this person has thought about it on a deeper level than I have, and is able to come to a conclusion about why this is the way it is, right? And you can see that it's not just me or the next person, but there's this universal element to it. And that's what it seems to be like Aristotle is, he often does, like and that's why it's a little frustrating, because I do have to say, I guess as a modern person, I'm more interested in the more dramatic element that comes to that comes along with modern philosophy, right? You know, or the critical view, you know, like Sartre, the waiter, or whatever, you know, whereas Aristotle's not, like I said, it'll just be like, and this is, you know, looking at a sculpture, or you know, I mean, which isn't even getting into the aesthetics of it, right? This is what were his examples again? Some of them were totally boring. I mean, teacher and learning was
Building a house.
obvious.
Yeah,
Building a house. Yeah, stuff like that. Or the plant. That was another example we had. And it's like, I feel like I'm in first grade again. Like, what's going on? Why are we looking at the plant cycle? Like, this is so incredibly boring. Like, I snooze fest, you know, like I want to get to the good stuff. You know what I mean? But it's like, no, I think he's saying that because, and I've seen this in some other philosophers too, is like, because they're trying to say, hey, like, I'm not making stuff up. I'm not, you know, I'm not out in this music of the spheres, just, you know, totally detached from reality. When, you know, and just being creative, you know, maybe, which is another, which sometimes is used by certain people as a derogatory thing for the way some of these, you know, some people philosophize. He's saying, actually, you know, I'm just, this is all around us all the time. Like, this is our, you know, our life, our experience, who we are. And so I think in that sense, it's refreshing, actually, because it's not like an elitist thing, you know, the idea of doing philosophy where, oh, there are the dumb people who need the religion, and then, you know, those of us who can escape that will do philosophy, you know. So I mean, and I don't know, I mean, you can agree or disagree with me, but Aristotle strikes me as being like one of the most, even though he drives me nuts, he also strikes me as being one of the most down to earth that I've encountered, because he really does take something so banal so seriously, and then will incorporate it into his work. And I'm like, oh my God. And I'm, you know, you know, I learned in the modern American system where I'm ready to be like, I want to go for the gold, you know, kind of thing. You know, and it's bad. I realize it's bad. Like I benefit immensely from him slowing me down. I really do. So even if I complain.
I appreciate that. Yeah, he does. He works in small change, and then all of a sudden, enormous consequences follow from all of these tiny little steps. And the other thing to say is that, you know, he works at the level of being and change and the most fundamental concepts of all. And so any progress made in the internal structure of those concepts will illuminate absolutely everything, because those concepts are involved in thinking anything. And so that's why he can go to these very homely examples and show that, you know, these very abstract in scare quotes, philosophical considerations actually make sense of this banal stuff in a way that the normal way of talking about them did. But anyway, so I appreciate that. Philip, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to make amendments for my role in taking us away from Aristotle and bring us right back to Aristotle. We were considering whether it was worthwhile to think about Aristotle's ideas on time. And here's an example where I think that understanding Aristotle and time is really important. Like when Aristotle considered, let's say, the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. It's possible to think of all those numbers as one complete entity that just sort of timelessly exists in some sort of sense. But Aristotle didn't go that route. He thought that yes, infinity was a worthwhile concept, but he believed in what he called a potential infinity, not a completed infinity. So what that meant is when you're counting, there's always more numbers if you need them.
Right.
And that's a weird sort of being for anything to have, right? That somehow there's more of them when you need them. And that obviously is a process that unfolds in time.
Right.
So it seems that that's an example where being is really intimately related with an unfolding process in time. And so maybe it is worthwhile reading Aristotle on time.
I appreciate that. Yeah, appreciate that. That's it's a possibility. It's a possibility.
And the continuum.
Yeah, that's the thing. We have to get into continuum and discretion and the kinds of unities each one of these are, and then, but yeah, it's all good. It's all Aristotle.
So, quick question.
Yeah.
This can be ignored if it takes us too far afield, but do things unfold in time, or is time the unfolding?
I'm not going to even try to answer that. I mean, I think time is time is a consequence of motion, and so at least for Aristotle, it seems that that priority of motion to time, and so yeah, that's as far as I can go on that one. I don't know. What made you ask that question?
I ran into the thought and I said the thought.
Okay. Well, if anybody else has a take on that, please offer it.
You're not supposed to say some things out loud, Tyler. That's all.
I did want to give I don't want to extensively comment. Do we still have Garth? Oh yeah, he's there. Okay, yeah, but I did very much I did very much appreciate the Garth's invocation of the primary philosophical virtue, which is just being concerned about truth and not being concerned about what good that would be for you. And I think that's one of the virtues I hope studying Aristotle actually develops in each one of us, right? We're always thinking, I want to get something out of this because I need it, or I need to understand this, or I need to understand that, and we're all of a sudden not focused on truth, not focused on how things are. And it's precisely the sobriety and the care that Aristotle brings to his endeavor that, I mean, you really, he will lose everybody who wants to get derive some personal advantage from his thought, right? And he will instill in us this this clarity about what it means to seek truth and therefore seek being, and what it entails and what it doesn't entail. So I think that Garth pointed to that virtue of truth, and I just wanted to reemphasize how important that is and what kind of self-discipline it takes to have your eyes on that prize and that prize alone. No hands? Well, then maybe I can finish my original thought, which I started the hour at, started at 4 o'clock. But I love this conversation, so thank you. I don't mind being interrupted or having, yeah. It wasn't even an interruption. It was just a series of conversations that came out of what I said. But I did want to get to this whole idea of, what we've been calling this concept, the concept of change. Now we have another way of saying that, right? We can say the definition associated with the name change instead of concept. What he does in book 1, chapter 7, is provide us with a definition of change that does not entail the impossibility of change. It is not a complete definition. It is the minimal set of, or the minimal content that we must think if we want to think change. And in thinking change, according to that which allows us to think it and not its opposite, not change, we now have a standard, a yardstick, to measure the phenomena of given to us by the senses. And so now we do not get the definition of change by abstracting common features from experience or from perceptions, but now equipped with a concept that does not entail its own negation. We now have a minimal standard for determining what in perception can count as change. And so now, rather than the concept coming from sensible material of perceptions, it's the sensible material that is now being thought through the concept of change, and we can weed out, okay, that's not real change over there. That's this is ambiguous change. This is a proper concept of change, or this is the proper example of change. Now experience is exactly what experience is: instances, particulars of something general, and that general we have in the definition of change that that is both consonant with the ways in which people usually talk about change, but purged of all content that would make it self-contradictory. And so here and this is just an opportunity to point this out, right? I mean, now this concept of change is the reality of change, and the stuff that in perceptions, the perceptual world, right, doesn't tell us what change is. The concept tells us what change is, and thereby we can then see what process or what events or what things in the perceptual world actually measure up to it. And we also have now a concept that will allow us to say, well, if you think change, the old way, it entails the non-existence of change. So you're not actually thinking about change, you're just using an empty word. And you can fumble around with definitions and try to make it fit some preferred set of facts, right? But it will always have this kernel of self-contradiction to it. And so this is what I mean by the insistence of the logical consistency of the concepts that the Greeks are obsessed with, right? It's not enough to use a word and have some practical advantages to it. You have to, that word has to be defined in such a way that there can be such a thing as what is thought in that word, or what is asserted or defined in that name. And that just explicating what I just explicated gives us a path to follow or to think through about what this alternative conception, this alternative understanding of a definition / a concept is for the Greeks, and why they're not hypothetical entities, and they're not abstract entities, and all this language, all this lingo that we use to talk about them. It doesn't fit what we've achieved in the physics with the minimal conception of change, and the relationship of that concept to the things the instances of it that are grasped through it, that we understand through it. We understand this is change. Why? Because this gives us, right, this set of particulars gives us form, lack, underlying subject. Those are the inner criteria of change, and this set of perceptions gives us that. But these other perceptions where change is sometimes used, right, simple change, going from unmusical to musical, it doesn't have, it has the lack, it has the form, but it doesn't have the underlying subject. So we're not dealing with change here. We're dealing with Parmenidean, one thing passing out of existence and another thing popping in for no reason. We're dealing with miracles, and we're dealing with going from the unmusical to the musical. So here, so what I want to say is that this is, since part of my task is to point this out, right? Thinking the concept of thinking the proper definition of change is thinking what the reality of change is, and it's only in knowing the reality of change that we can pick out the proper instances. So here we have this, even though Aristotle is going against Parmenides in some of his conclusions that Parmenides drew, here we have an example of what I'm talking about when I say that being and the being of change and the concept of change, or the definition that doesn't entail its contradictory opposite, are one. They're not two different things. And it's through this that we can find authentic instances of change. And in finding those authentic instances of change, we are coming to know nature, his concept of nature. Okay. So that was the other thing I wanted to focus on, this concept thing, so that I can make this being and thought are one, and show how that we might be able to think what Aristotle gives us in the definition of change as being an example of that, and how perceptual reality stands to that. The concept or the definition is the judge. It's not that reality is the judge of whether we have the right concepts, because we don't get our concepts from the sensible particulars. All right, thanks. That was I really wanted to get that whole point out today, so thanks for letting me get it out. And now I see some hands, so I've got Clark and then Sandy.
Yeah, so that recitation you've attempted many times, and you succeeded many times, in my view. And I don't get it. I can't hear it enough, because I do pick up things. So this time I kind of picked up, it seems to me that what's in, I don't know if it's implied or stated outright, that Parmenides never described change. It was impossible for him to describe change, given how he saw things and how he framed it. So in a way, Aristotle's saying, that's what he's saying, I think, to Parmenides, from what I heard you just say, is that Parmenides, you did not describe the three minimal aspects, properties of what all change comprises.
Exactly.
The form, the lack, and the underlying substance.
Subject, not substance. Sorry.
Oh, so tell me, okay, so not substance.
Right. So at the end of chapter 1, he says, this gives us the question whether form or underlying subject is substance. So he said the physics opens up this question, but it's not a question that can be answered in the physics. So that's one of those little points where he's directing us to what will ultimately become worked out in the metaphysics, right? Is the form or is the underlying subject / matter properly substance, what things really are? That is not a physics question, that is a metaphysics question. But the question arises in the physics, and that's where it's super important to understand that all metaphysical questions are rooted not in an airy-fairy kingdom, but arise precisely from thinking clearly. Things like change and continuum and time and these things that have some kind of empirical, what do I want to say? Well, some kind of empirical reality, some that manifest in some way or another in what our perceptions give us.
So, yeah, I just wanted to tack on one more little thing, and that is, and in the same way that I think Parmenides could be accused of not ever making an argument for change. So how could he refute it? How is Aristotle exactly making an argument for being changing? That's I don't grasp.
Well, yeah, but he hasn't gone there yet. He hasn't gone there yet. He's just at the very tip, right? We just have the minimal conditions and what's one interesting point to add to that is in thinking change, and thinking change as something that can be rather than something that cannot be, we think matter, lack, and underlying subject or matter, and eventually we think also potency and activity and all of these other things, right? And so now we've begun, through change and thinking the logic of change that would make change real. We have the content of that concept. Are these other concepts: matter, form, underlying subject, right? And these aren't things that we get from perception or the empirical world either, right? It's just the content of the definition. And so every one of these concepts gives us an avenue of further exploration. How do we talk about matter? How do we talk about form? How do we talk about actuality? What are the concepts that actually belong to these, such that when I use the term actuality, I'm not using it in such a way that I'm implying the non-existence of actuality, but it's actually a coherent concept, right? And so now we have, we've breached the intelligible. And if we stay there, we'll stay in the intelligible, and we'll just be working out the inner relations, the inner structural dependencies of the entire intelligible world, if we stay there. If we catapult ourselves out and insist on not going there, or talking about other things, or introducing non-intelligible stuff into the intelligible for whatever historical reasons, that's just the way we talk, we will be catapulted right out of that, and then we'll be confused. We'll be confused about what our words mean and all the rest of it. So I just want to say, that we've actually taken a step into, by the study of change, we've taken a step into the intelligible, and what we're getting is further intelligible contents: matter, form, actuality, possibility, and these themselves will lead to further intelligible contents. And then we're going to see that all these things are they're interrelated. They're interrelated with many other things that have to do with being and soul and totality, the wholes and parts, etc. So I just want to point that out, that in a sense we've just, at least a little part of us is peering outside of the Platonic cave right now, and starting to look at what things look like outside of the cave. That's a metaphor, but I just wanted to give you a pedagogical device to think about what we've actually attained. Anyway, yeah, thanks. Done. Okay, got a couple of hands. Sandy, Philip, and then Ed.
A question. Can you just repeat the question that you said arises in the physics, but has to be answered in the metaphysics? Is form or underlying subject / matter? What was the rest of that?
Substance. Which one's substance? Which one is what is properly called being, and which one is derivative of the other, right? So
Okay.
we know from the Greeks there's a hierarchy of being. Some things are more than other things, and
right.
And so the question is the underlying subject being in a higher sense than form, or is form being in a higher sense than the underlying subject?
And a question about lack.
Yeah.
What is the counterpart to that? Is that form?
Yeah.
Okay. And I find the lack very interesting, the concept of lack. This seems to me not to have even arisen for someone like Parmenides, because if there's no change,
right,
there can't even be,
there can be
lack,
no lack
at all.
Exactly.
Right. So this is like moving from 2D to 3D, kind of like, I mean, that's just sort of like what it feels like to me. Like before, it's like a totally different terrain, I guess, that Aristotle kind of winds up exploring, because all of these new, I mean, not new is maybe not the word, but these before non-existent concepts or suddenly come into view and have to be dealt with, and then are informing everything else through their relations. Because I mean, it seems to me the lack thing it seems like maybe I'm just, this is just my intuition speaking, but it seems to me like some people would have a problem with it. Like they would be like, no, there can't be lack. That's BS. There's no such thing as lack. Everything's already here. Like we're dust, and we're just a sack of bones and dust, and then that's what we become when we die. And the idea that there, you know what I mean? Like there's kind of a cynical interpretation, I think, around I mean, because I know on the one hand we saw the Parmenidean thing kind of getting very woo-woo and you know, like the spiritual but not religious crowd sort of thing. Right. But then it seems like it can also be a very cynical, almost kind of nihilistic, maybe, interpretation of that as well. Because I don't know why, but I can just immediately, like if I felt like I just sat down at some kind of philosophy symposium, we started talking about lack, I can immediately see certain especially sciencey empirical types getting upset by this idea. I don't know why. It just seems to be like
that's every concept that Aristotle's explicating change with is purely intelligible, and it's not empirical. And I think, you know, an empiricist who wants to define motion is going to define it as, you know, a passage from A to B. But unfortunately, a passage already is already motion, and so he or she has defined it by itself, and it's become circular. And that's always going to happen with an empiricist or an empirically oriented definition of something that's only intelligible. Change is only intelligible. It's not empiric. Like I said before a number of times, and just as a reminder, right? Perception doesn't tell us whether things pop in and out of existence or whether there's an underlying identity that has gone from one state to another. Perception cannot decide that question. And no perceptions can tell us which is the right take. Bertrand Russell brings this up to his, what was I going to say? To his credit. So it's not just an Aristotelian problem. It plagues empiricism from day one on. So yeah, so we philosophers, we can just point out to people who have problems with this stuff. I'd say, you know, you need lack in order to think change, and if you don't have these minimal conditions, then you're not thinking change. You're just using the word. So yeah, we don't want to be distracted by people who don't want to think too much, or just insist on things because there's a certain culture of speaking about things in a certain way. See, I got a couple more hands, and before people start leaving, I just wanted to say I'm so on the cusp of, okay, when we start up again, we talk about Schmidt often enough that it seems to me like people who are interested should be able to read it in a discussion group, and maybe some people want some refresher. And so what I'm thinking is, you know, that we do our Aristotle one week, and then we do our informal, and we do the informal by opening up a discussion of some of the Schmidt stuff. So I'm just thinking about that, so people don't have to go and read Schmidt all by themselves, because it is a big long work and all the rest of it. But I think that might be throw an interesting light on what we're doing in the main Aristotle sessions, and also give a chance to recoup or to learn for the first time what these important ideas that Schmidt conveys. The reason why Schmidt's brought up a lot is because most of us who started an interest in Greek philosophy, I begged everybody, I said, before you read any Greek philosophy, you have to read Schmidt, because you have to become aware of all the crap you're bringing with you to the Greeks and that prevent you from grokking at all what's going on there. And then, even though people were suspicious, it was a huge book, it turned out to be a really good experience. And so that's why Schmidt brought up over and over and over again. And I thought maybe a little primer, maybe 200 or 300 pages of a 500 or 600 page book would be a good thing for everybody who's committed to continuing to work on Aristotle. I just wanted to announce that before people start dropping off, and maybe you can write me an email or something like that if you're interested, or send me a message on Meetup. But I did want to get to the hands that are still raised. So got Philip first, and then Ed.
Yeah, so I may be one of these people who needs to read Schmidt, because I have a question that I find very difficult to formulate except in a very anachronistic way. So I'm very comfortable with the idea that the concepts do not originate in experience or empiricism,
No.
are not caused by empiricism or that sort of thing. But I can't help but wonder if there's some kind of relation of confirmation or something like that, right? So Aristotle has a concept. It originated not in empiricism, but he's living his life, he's gathering empirical evidence as he lives his life. And surely somehow the fact that the concept is in harmony with the way things appear to him in his everyday life, surely that provides something like confirmation. I realize that's an anachronistic word, like confirmation of the usage of the term, right?
Right.
What could be more 20th century than that?
Right.
But how can I, surely there's some kind of harmony between the concept and the way the world seems. Yes? What do you think?
I don't know. I feel like I'm being led onto thin ice here. Peter, did you want to respond to Philip because you popped up? Or did you have a separate question or comment?
Well, it wasn't what Philip said. Well, what Philip said nudged me into my obligatory must mention the posterior analytics at least once in a meetup kind of comment. Where I just wanted to seem apropos to repeat that perception, while we perceive the individual, a concrete individual thing, perception is of the universal. And it's, I don't know, that seemed apropos for some reason. I forgot now why.
Okay. Right, because Philip was talking about confirmation, and Aristotle is trying to think about what constitutes the principle of a science, the science being the science of nature. The science of nature is a science of movement, and so we need to know what the principle would be that defines the object of this inquiry, and then all the concepts, or all the names with their corresponding definitions that are relevant to a science of moving and movable things, right? And so since we're constituting the framework of the science, we're not doing empirical inquiry yet. Aristotle does that, and it's super interesting in the writings on the parts of animals, and right. But right now we're just constituting the object of the science. The object of the science is called nature. Nature is the totality of that which moves and is movable. And so when we inquire into nature, we must know what it is to move and to be movable. And the standard linguistic uses available to Aristotle, something becomes something, are all ambiguous on this, right? And then he finds, in virtue of his developed concept, he discovers that there's also a linguistic formulation of the concept that gets at that captures all the important conceptual elements, namely something comes from something. And so that becomes the, so to speak, the linguistic schema for talking about change qua change, and therefore the object of a science of change qua change, which is the science of nature. So we're not actually looking for any confirmation, and there's no possible confirmation of the determination of the object of a science, right? But there is only the question of how to then develop empirical hypotheses within the realm of the object of this science. And so, yeah, so I want to say, so confirmation is kind of situated at a different level than what Aristotle's doing with physics, if that makes sense. Let me see. Ed.
Yeah, your earlier soliloquy, which kind of talked about opening the door unto the intelligible.
Right.
I think that the idea of trying to open the door to the intelligible, that's what Aristotle and Parmenides would have in common.
Oh yeah, exactly.
That's where they're drinking from the same trough, or trying to do the same thing. They have different results, but they're both trying to do the same thing. If that's what's being aimed for,
No, exactly. No, I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right.
you know. And then the other was just a little comment about the lack. It always seems sort of funny that Aristotle remarks that lack can itself be the cause of something.
Yeah.
Which it works when he explains it, but it's funny to think about.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I want to get to when we come back from our break, get back to book 2 and really, equipped with what we've learned together and think about what he says about causes. And I think that we can purge a little bit of the modern associations of this term a little bit better than when we first broached it. All right, it's 6 o'clock. This lasted. I'm open to any further conversation, but people who want just 2 hours of this and for their sanity are welcome to check out.
Could I quickly put in a plug for my Kant group?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Every second Sunday. Well, I'm in Canada, but north of Toronto. My friend Jerry and I, we do an Immanuel Kant group. We are reading the First Critique. We are doing it slowly, and we're also reading Henry Allison's book, Kant's Transcendental Deduction, alongside Kant. And everybody's welcome. And just to be clear, it's every second Sunday, so there's lots of time to do the readings.
Are you reading the Transcendental Idealism or the book on just the deductions?
We are reading the second edition of Allison's main book, which now you've got me doubting myself.
Okay,
Transcendental Idealism.
It's
Yes.
posted on the website.
The idealism.
I'm holding it up. It's that
Yeah,
creamy
and
yellow.
Right.
Creamy yellow. There you go.
Because he came out with a big book about the deductions recently, so I thought you might be reading that. But anyway, yeah, good to clarify that. Thanks.
Yep, and it's through the Toronto Philosophy Meetup, and we're not that far in because we're going slowly on purpose, so plenty of time to catch up.
And just an FYI to Philip, I'm actually going to try and make it this time. I was meaning to make it a couple of times ago, but I simply forgot because I have a weak brain or something.
And who's that? I don't have the visuals.
Oh, it's Peter.
Oh, hi, yeah. It's going to be good this week.
All right, cool. Thank you for announcing that. All right, so we got a little break, hit me up with some kind of message or something like that if you like the Schmidt idea. And if I don't get any responses, that's totally cool too. That just tells me that we're still tepid on this. But when you're ready to kickstart that, I think I have a pretty good idea how to whittle the book down to about a third of its size. And just to get those
Still 300 pages or something.
Well, even if it's only 100 pages, he's got some difficult prose. But yeah, anyway, take a look at the book or take a look at the links that have been offered, and if they're read around a little bit of it, and if it strikes your fancy, I would love to revisit it, and maybe a couple other people who read it once would too.
Yeah, I'm all for it, because you guys have been bringing up Schmidt since the beginning, just now and then, it definitely was influential. And so I'm just curious. So regardless, I'm going to try to take a look at it anyway, but
Cool.
it'll be fun.
Yeah, if you think Schmidt is the shit, then I'm for it.
Oh yeah. Schmidt is the shit. And you know what? He was so cool. After I reached out to him, I said, hey, we read your book and in Portland, Oregon, we got a Schmidt fan club here. And he's like, oh, that's great. And so we wanted him to come talk to us. And he's like, well, you have to submit formal questions because I don't want to, I want to do justice to your concerns. So we submitted the questions, and we had a Zoom meeting with him from Germany where he addressed everybody's questions more or less. And he said, yeah, maybe you do that for us again. So that was pretty exciting. Peter.
Important minor clarification. Schmidt is the Scheisse.
Schmidt is the, yeah, that's cool. So
Schmidt would be the Hammer.
Okay, cool. The Hammer. That's right. The Hammer.
Hammer time. Hammer time.
Thanks, everybody.
Hey, I just want to say, I'm getting enough love of Schmidt here that that I'm committed to do it. So I'll just make an announcement to everybody here. When after August, I'll let everybody breathe a little bit, and then after August, we'll come up with a framework for doing that.
His fans are called Schmidt heads.
Yes. I love it. Thank you so
But
much.
Dick
Thanks, everybody.
Dale had his fan club as well. I won't elaborate.
Who?
Dick Dale and the surf guy, surf drop from the Dick Dale and the Dick something heads. Anyway,
I noticed the book's really
Got it.
expensive. Does anybody know how to get around that? Or
No, the books are horrendously expensive, and when we did this book group the first time, I found somebody on ABE Books, whatever it's called, who had like 10 copies, and then or 7 or 8 copies, and then I said, you know, can you give us a deal if I buy in bulk? And he did, and so it ended up costing people about $50 a book.
We have access to the PDF though.
Yeah, I personally hate reading from PDFs, so I understand that people do hate that. Yeah, I'll look
I'd much
honestly.
prefer a print version.
Yeah, I totally get it, and it is horrendously expensive. And I wish there was a. Well, all you have to do is learn to read German, and then the German edition is less expensive.
Is it? Is it? That would be a real struggle for me, but I could probably do it.
Yeah, you know, I have to say, you know, his syntax is brutal. So.
Oh no, can't do it then. I can read Wittgenstein. I have trouble with the
Yeah, if his syntax is really bad, then he has to pay that sin tax.
No, yeah. No, but I mean, you know, we would not read the whole book. I don't think, and so maybe you could endure the PDF if I can't find an inexpensive copy of and buy like 3 or 4 of them at a time for people who are interested. But right.
The PDF posted on your site?
No, but I will. I'll just put it in the comment section for today. I have it on my Google Drive, so I'll just do the Google Drive link on the comment section for today's Aristotle meeting, and I'll do it in both groups, the Philosophy and Gamblers one and the Portland Free Philosophy Lectures one, okay? That way it's fairly easily available. Cool, I'm looking forward to that. It was a great experience to do the Schmidt, and maybe it will make, give Aristotle a little bit more existential urgency than maybe you're feeling right now.